Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this discussion this evening. It's great to see a full house. The title of tonight's event is examining, or hopefully solving, Britain's housing conundrum. I mean, that's obviously what many people have been trying to do for several decades, and I don't know, the panel will tell me if how far we've succeeded on that. So if people don't know about Civic Future, I'll just give a very brief introduction. Civic Future is a non-profit organisation, a charity, founded late last year, so we're still a relatively new organisation, with the hope of twofold. One, we have a fellowship where we identify and train the next generation of public leaders in many of the big moral, philosophical, and political discussions of our time. And we also host public events, seminars. We have an annual conference that we did in July, which was on the Great Stagnation, with the keynote Tyler Cowen, which some people in the audience actually attended. We also host these kind of salon-style events and private events, bringing together people interested in many of the big public policy questions, but also other types of discussions with interesting thinkers, and hopefully raising the level of public debate and building a network of different people interested in actually solving many of the challenges that we face today. So I'm really excited to be introducing this fantastic panel. So we have John Myers, who is the co-founder of YIMBY Alliance, which campaigns for better housing and with the support from local communities. We also have Simon Thomas, who is a campaigner for better planning at local, regional and national levels. He has been involved in local and neighbourhood plan action and is a parish councillor focusing on planning for 8 years. We also have Ike Ijeh, who is an architect, and he's also head of planning, head of housing and urban space at Policy Exchange. And he's also the author of Designing London and 50 Greatest Architects. And also right next to me here, we have Andrew Orlowski, who is coming at this from a different perspective. You're not necessarily campaigning or in policy, but you write about some of the discussions and some of the questions today. So he's a business columnist at the Telegraph. So firstly, thank you so much for my panel and really looking forward to having this discussion. And I'm Inaya, I work at Civic Future and I'm going to be chairing this discussion. So we're going to start off with quite a broad and open question that our panel has been briefed on. Just before we go into it, just house rules, we're going to have 5 to 7 minutes opening introductions from the panel. Then we'll have a chaired discussion, hopefully teasing out some of the arguments that they put forward. And then we're going to go to the floor. And so please ask lots of questions. We want this to be a much more collaborative discussion, not just us talking at you. So the question that we're going to start off with to all of the panelists, nothing small, what is the biggest challenge facing British housing policy today and how do we solve it? So I'm going to start with you, John.
Thanks very much, Inaya. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to Civic Future as well. So first of all, I'm going to give you one astonishing fact, and then I'm going to try and answer the question. The most astonishing problem facing British housing is its incredible scarcity. So in one respect, we have about the most expensive housing in the developed world. But on the other hand, we also have about the cheapest and crummiest housing in the developed world. Now, let's take a step back and try and understand why that might be. What does a healthy housing situation look like? There's a famous paper by the economists Ed Glazer and Joe Giorco, which looked at different cities across the United States and found that where there is where people build homes in plentiful quantities, then the price of a home never rises very much above what it costs to build a home, because if prices go up, people just build more homes. Whereas in cities where they don't build very many homes, like San Francisco, for example, you see that prices will rise very far above the cost of building more homes. And that's why you also get a boom and bust cycle, because it means that when there's less demand, prices crash back down again, and that's bad for everyone. So we can distinguish between the cost of building a home and the price at which it sells. And the difference between those two numbers for the total amount of homes in the UK, if you add up the value, the market price of all the homes in the UK, and you subtract off what it would cost to build them at today's prices if they didn't exist, the difference between those two numbers is about £5 trillion, which, if my maths are correct, about £70,000 per head. That's just the artificial scarcity value from the fact that we haven't built as many homes as we should have over the last 80 years. And the buildings, as I said, are worth much less. So in fact, per head, the buildings themselves, the construction cost of those buildings is less than any other major developed country. We have, in value per head terms, about the crummiest homes of any other OECD country. The buildings that our homes are composed of are worth less per head than those, for example, of Spain, Germany, France, even of the Czech Republic, although we do just about beat Mexico. Now, why is that? Fundamentally, we've built less than other countries and less than we used to for about 80 years. Since World War II, we've never grown the amount of homes in the country at the rate we did in the 1820s or the 1930s. Right? So name one other industry where we underperform the 1820s. And there's good evidence that the average household will be 10 to 20% better off if we had a better system. So that's £3,000 to £6,000 extra per year to the average household. And it's not just that, of course, because failing to build enough homes causes other problems. People living in cramped conditions, grandparents worrying about where their grandkids are going to live. So that's the fact. The problem, of course, is how we build more and better homes in ways that local communities are happy to support. Because if we don't achieve that, no solution is going to last. Homeowners, I regret to inform the sort of aggressive YIMBY faction out there, are 2/3 of the voters, and they care very much about the place where they live. And part of the problem is that we have a planning system that, rather than being designed to find options that win broad support, was begun with a Westminster knows best approach, forcing things on local communities. So I'd agree with Andrew, for example, that NIMBYs are mainly trying simply to do the best for their families and their communities. I'd agree with him that hostility to suburbia and suburban people is bad and unhelpful. I grew up in a suburb. It was a safe and nurturing place. But also, hostility to inner urban people isn't helpful. So I would say we should approach this with good faith as a problem of how do we act collectively to make this better. What we shouldn't do is escalate it into some kind of identity war. And the only thing we know is what Einstein told us, that if we keep on doing the same thing as we have for 80 years and expect a different outcome, that is the definition of madness. So I don't propose to know exactly what the right answers are. Sorry, Inaya. But I do know that unless we find new ways to square that circle, to build more homes in ways that local communities can support, then we'll be stuck in the same doom loop that's damaged so many lives for generations. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to dive into many of the thoughts that you've shared there in a moment. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you. And thank you, John. And nice to see everybody and appreciate the invitation. As said, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm a resident who actually got so fed up, I became a councillor. And then I actually started organising campaigns. I'm not a NIMBY, because we sit down and talk to the councils, we talk to the developers about the most appropriate developments. However, we have a big problem, and it's about 3 miles away by the River Thames, next door to Westminster Bridge. It's Parliament, because what we have is a situation where we have enormous amounts of promises, headlines, sound bites, very few of which are actually delivered. And if they are delivered, they're delivered very late, and they're never delivered in an integrated way. I believe we've had 15 housing ministers in the last 10 years and something like 6 secretaries of state. Well, in my commercial environment, that would be suicide. You wouldn't get any continuity. And so why can we expect housing policy to be delivered consistently? It's not going to happen. To the point, one of the problems we've got, and I'm one of those that was very lucky. I bought in 1980, and I've accumulated an enormous capital value out of my property, but that's my pension, because the rest of my pension shot to pieces. And also I've helped both my daughters purchase houses, and they're very, very lucky. But we're the exception. The majority of the country do not have that option, where they're living on a standard living wage or just above, where they've got housing multiple in terms of their salary to the house price locally, something around 6 to 8, and if you move close to London, 11 to 14. And the problem we get is when those mortgages come home to roost. And I think the last 18 months has been a salutary lesson to everybody of what can happen when interest rates go up. They haven't gone up anywhere near as much as they were when I first bought. They were at 13% and went up to 15%. I can tell you that hurt. I don't think interest rates have stopped yet either. And I think with the issues we've got economically, with a stagnating economy, with the cost of capital going up, with capital leaching out of the country continuously over the last 6 months, we are actually in a perilous situation as a country. And we need to actually do what I think it was David Cameron first introduced, called localism. We supported that and we put a neighbourhood plan together. It took us 3.5 years and we had to fight with the local authority to do it how we thought was properly. We actually were complimented by our examining inspector. And guess what? We actually allocated houses, and we allocated 1 and 2 bedroomed houses in terraces, and we deemed that 40% must be affordable. That's affordable at the 20% off market rate. That's not properly affordable, which brings me to my main comment, which I will make in answer to your question. Our biggest single problem is we do not have enough affordable social housing in this country at an affordable rent that people can actually manage. And it's getting worse and worse week by week. We need to find a way to subsidise the marketplace to actually build what used to be called council housing many years ago, of a decent standard with good design, not a continuation of the current speculative development of 3 and 4 bedroomed executive homes built without infrastructure, not on transport lines, that then result in additional car mobility. If we put the overlay of the climate crisis and environmental concerns as we're building on our farmland, so it can no longer be used for crops or animals, it's a pretty sorry state of affairs. So I think the answer is we actually, all parts of society need to come together and actually get our politicians to do what they should be doing.
Thank you. Just double checking, can people at the back hear? Okay, could just make sure we speak up so everyone can hear. Over to you.
Right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you for Civic Future invited me as well. Nice, easy question. How do we solve the housing crisis? Well, I would say, to start off with, I would identify the biggest problem, as I think both my previous speakers have alluded to, is the lack of supply. We have a critical undersupply of housing in this country. Now, very simplistically, like most architects do, I'm going to come up with 3 magical solutions that are going to solve everything. Now, the first, very easily, it's very easy to say this, and I know it's difficult to do, we do need to reform the planning system. It's been mentioned by both previous speakers. At the moment, essentially, if any of you wanted to build an extension to your house, you essentially go through the same planning process that a developer would do if they're building a 30-story tower block in the center of a town center. It's inefficient, it's slow, it doesn't provide certainty. The planning system has to be reformed. Now, I'm not one of these abolitionists in this sense who look at the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act and say it was the biggest evil ever perpetuated in the country. I mean, at the end of the day, notwithstanding what John said about the 1930s, we did build close to 350,000 homes a year in the 1950s and 60s when the Town and Country Planning Act was in place. But regardless of that, there are obvious problems with the planning system at the moment. Now, I would say there's 2 things we could do to improve the planning system. The first is we need to a degree, break the discretionary principle. We can't be inventing the wheel with every planning application. We have to have some kind of means whereby larger schemes can have pre-approval if they subscribe or if they comply with a set amount of rules or design codes or planning frameworks that are already in place. And so the onus is them automatically having planning permission, so you don't need to go through the whole process of applying and reinventing the wheel every time. The other thing we need to do in terms of reforming planning is to democratize planning as well. Now, I know NIMBYism is going to feature largely in our discussion probably. I mean, I find the term NIMBY unhelpful, to be honest. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we live in a democracy. I wouldn't want to live in a democracy where people's right to object is diluted. Everybody has a right to object. The way to Well, one of the ways to address NIMBYism is by increasing quality and by improving consultation. People have to feel invested, as if they've been consulted in their local areas and in what's been built. Policy Exchange, however, we do a lot of polling around this area. One of the things we're doing at the moment is tall buildings. We did a poll of 1,500 people in London, and 64% of them thought that they hadn't been adequately consulted over the issue of tall buildings in London, where they should be, whether they want them. That's a large amount of people who feel completely cut off from the planning process. So I think democratizing the planning process and breaking the discretionary principle, things like design codes, street votes as well, I think those are some of the things we need to do. That's only the first point. The second point is, I would say this again, Policy Exchange has been behind a campaign called Building Beautiful. We need to build better quality housing. It needs to, whether you call it beauty or placemaking or design quality, we just have to improve the quality of our housing. Too often, it's not good enough. Now, I know beauty is a contentious term, and I get it. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You can go around the room, people have different ideas of what beauty is. I remember at school, when my English teacher loved Jane Austen. I can't stand Jane Austen. I couldn't read any of those books. I found them turgid in the extreme. I love Charlotte Bronte, Wuthering Heights. They're both beautiful examples of literature. It doesn't mean that I was right or my English teacher was wrong. You have different opinions, that's fine. The important thing is not everybody agreeing on what's beautiful, it's everybody agreeing that beauty is important. And that's what we have to do in terms of making sure that the quality of what we build improves. Now, in terms, I mean, we have made headways with that. Michael Gove barely goes 5 minutes these days without mentioning the word beauty. That's a long way from the night. I'll briefly talk about one of my favorite Margaret Thatcher anecdotes. In the 1980s, London was very different to what it is now. Declining population. It wasn't as successful as it is today. And in Paris, at the time, President Mitterrand was building his grand projets. The Louvre Pyramid, the new Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, all these sparkling urban projects were going up. And Sir Terence Conran, the late Terence Conran, allegedly spoke to Margaret Thatcher and begged her, he said, look at Paris, look at London, it's declining. We need to have these kind of beautiful objects in London too. And she said to have thought very closely about it and then answered and said, oh, well, if you really feel that strongly about it, you can have the opportunity to design a new table for the Cabinet Office. So that's not what he meant. But I just give you that anecdote to give you an idea. In the 1980s, it would have been very unusual for a politician to talk about beauty. Now, as I said, Gove talks about it all the time. It's very much invested in our political dialogue. Just before I go into my final point, I think beauty is also important. We can't just talk about individual beauty of buildings or design quality of buildings. We have to think in a civic sense. We have to make better places. We have to have good placemaking. We have to make our areas, our streets, our public spaces, we have to make them as independent on quality or as reflective of quality as individual buildings. This has to be something that has a civic dimension and not just an individual architectural dimension. And a good example of that is the great estates in London. If you go to all the best parts of London that people love most, Covent Garden, Belgravia, Mayfair, those were all private speculation. The government wasn't involved. It was private aristocrats building the city. And you can look at it today. I mean, today you still can't go in Portman Square or Belgravia Square or Belgrave Square unless you live there. On one level, you can say that's socially regressive, but look at the public good they gave. Those wonderful squares, they reinvented London, and they embedded this idea of a natural landscape in the center of our city. So those are ways in which private development, if it has beauty in mind or good quality in mind, can have a public good. Finally, the final magical solution to low supply of housing, I think, echoing the point made before me, we need to build more council housing. Affordability is critical. It's not just enough putting up homes everywhere. London's built thousands and thousands of units of new housing in recent decades. A lot of it is luxury housing that is not in any way affordable for people on low or average incomes. So we need to meaningfully build a new generation of council housing. Some of the statistics I'll attach to that is, in 1981, 31% of the UK housing stock was council homes. Now it's 13%. We all know the kind of political things that happen as to why that's the case. We need to find a way of meaningfully bringing that up. Why do we need to do that? There's a financial reason. At the moment, the state spends £30 billion on housing benefit. That's estimated to go up to 71 billion by 2050. Housing benefit is essentially the state subsidising private landlords. Surely it's a much better and more cost-effective use of public money to actually build council houses, so we don't need to subsidise public landlords through massive expenditure in housing benefit. So I think council housing is critical, this overall solution, and it's also critical because, look, at the end of the day, we can build as many homes as we like, but in London, the average house price is 12 times higher than the average salary. There's not enough space to build enough homes to make that to square that economic circle. So council housing has to be part of it. And just to conclude, another good thing about council housing is it will help. Many people think beauty is an elitist thing. Oh, beauty is a classical buildings. It doesn't have to be. They think beauty is expensive to procure. It's not. I can take anyone around London and show you the most profoundly ugly developments that cost loads of money to build. So it's not necessarily something that is dependent on cost. And by making sure that we have a new generation of council houses that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past, it has good quality, good public spaces, good design, that's how we make sure that beauty doesn't become a kind of elitist ideal. It's something that's an egalitarian principle that applies to all of us. And just to conclude, if you want an example of that, I know I've said that about 3 times, not very far from here, there's a place called Arnold Circus, the Boundary Estate in Shoreditch, built in 1899, the first council estate in the world. Built under a Tory government, they didn't have that much to do with it, it was the LCC who built it, but that gives you an idea of our idea of a stigmatised council estate or council housing doesn't have to be the way we build in the future, and there is a better way to build housing for people on the lowest incomes.
Thank you. Just quickly, there is actually a seat at the front here. If someone wanted to just squeeze in, Joe, if anyone wanted to sit there, feel free to do. So,
good at that one, someone.
over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think my preceding panel, can you hear me, by the way? Okay.
Yeah.
The preceding panelists have made some great points, and actually, as an introduction, I was going to think of some things to butter you up with, where I also probably agree with most of you as well. The frustration of getting any kind of infrastructure built in the UK, the ease with which people can say no, but it seems very difficult to actually get anything achieved, and I think it was alluded to earlier was the appalling quality of boxes which are now sprawling over the countryside. But look, I can't sugarcoat it. I'm not here to agree with everyone. I suspect I wouldn't be invited if I did. The answer to the question is, I think the biggest policy problem with housing policy is us. It's people in London who formulate and advance and influence policy. It's people who work at think tanks. It's people who write newspaper columns, media influencers. It's the way we conduct ourselves. It's the things we say. And why do I think this? Well, look, I'll confess I'm fascinated with housing policy in the way that people become fascinated by true crime podcasts or serial killers or car crashes. I'm fascinated by certain aspects of specifically the housing policy discourse, which I find really troubling. And it seems to be be emblematic of policy in general, which doesn't just not speak people's language, but it's incapable of being empathetic enough to understand what people want and how people actually conceive the world and want it to move forward. So building near me being somebody who's had a housing development proposed near them, generally means the degradation of their environment, the degradation of their infrastructure, longer queues at the GPs, difficulty in getting school places, traffic jams and so on. And of course aesthetics. So nobody rational goes, yes, let's do that. Let's make my town even worse. But I think there's also some really interesting characteristics I want to draw out of housing policy I've heard advanced here. One of them, there's a kind of peculiar fascination with tweaks and fixes and hacks, and tweaks that bypass very complex entrenched disputes, which are very clever but just don't work. There are also, street votes I think is one of them. I think it's, I don't object to it, it's great, I would put it on the statute book, but I don't see it being any kind of solution to a housing crisis. I mean, for example, I can name you 4 adjacent streets where you'd have a positive vote for a development. I can take one street away, it would be a no vote. So who chooses these blocks in block votes is problematic. That's just one example. But the housing policy debate, I think, has become very sour and very toxic. And it also seems to have a load of just odd prejudices. People are carrying a lot of prejudices around with them. Prejudice against families, against gardens, the stuff that people actually want to build. And this is kind of, I think somebody recently described NIMBYs as the new Kulaks, and they must be destroyed. And somewhere on Twitter is ranting about this. I'll mention a couple in the Critic article. My favourite is on Twitter. Sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. Where is he? Oh, here he is. YIMBY martial law enforcer. And the handle is great. It's repeal TCPA 1947. And it's just like blind hatred against, I don't know, mum and dad. You know, Freud would have a bloody field day with this. It's amazing. But anyway, I think this is really unhelpful, and dragging, you know, intergenerational conflict into this is bad. People have reasons for wanting to do what they do. NIMBYs should not be your enemies, they should be your partners, because I think given the choice, they would design far better houses than big developers would. There's also this, so that's the rhetorical model, I think. So all this points to something I've encountered before, which has got the name solutionism. I must say solutionism is not intended as a compliment. Solution is making things worse. I think the intervention of American money into the housing policy, UK housing policy debate has not made it better. It's an import. It's teenagers saying feds to hear politicians talking about zoning. We don't have zones in Britain. It makes no sense to talk about zoning. And I think YIMBY has been, with respect to John, it's been around for a few years and it hasn't caught on. Poor old Barnet YIMBY, I checked tonight before I came out, has 105 followers and tweeted in February. Cambridge YIMBY has 273, and it sprang back to life in July with a tweet, but that died again. Poor old Eastleigh is the one I feel sorry for. That's got 80. So I think solutionism, hacks and so on is very ineffective as a housing policy debate. I think maybe there's more people want to be involved and have positive solutions for it. But I think the biggest of all, and I did mention this in the Critic article, I've had 3 of my previous panellists have described it as a supply problem. No, it's not. Even by focusing on supply and demand, I think is a mistake. When somebody says we need 4 million new homes, which I hear a lot from housing people in the country go, is that 4 million more people in dinghies? We're in this situation, and I may agree with you, I'm very, very liberal. My parents were refugees. The state has lost control of the borders. The Critic, facetiously, I think, tongue-in-cheek, labelled my article, NIMBYs are the true revolutionaries. Well, I don't think they are, but there's a case for saying that NIMBYism is the only really effective grassroots political movement in Britain, and people voted in a certain way in 2016 and 2019, and that vote was betrayed. So it's almost like a guerrilla movement of trying to define how Britain should look like in the future in their particular way. If you want to win any housing policy debate, I think you've got to address demand, and you've got to be much more empathetic and sympathetic to the houses people actually want. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for the opening from panel. So, lots to get into. I'll start with you, John. Funnily enough, I was going to ask about the question of supply. One thing that I think about, there's people that, you know, have saved really hard, got on the housing ladder, and lots of people in the country, and they want their house to go up in price, because that's the idea that we've set as the ideal in our society. You know, you cash in on your property in like 10, 15 years' time. So if you then build lots and lots and lots of houses, would that not affect people's asset appreciating? So what do you say to that? Because actually some people might be quite resistant to the idea for a purely, you know, self-interested reason that lots of people actually want to be able to have their asset appreciate.
So I think this goes to this great question. It goes to 2 insightful things that Andrew said, which is that the only way that I can see to win on this is to get at least some of the NIMBYs on side, and that the other point is that if we focus purely from a rhetorical perspective on supply and price, that is an inherently divisive framing that doesn't help to build a coalition to actually get change through. So, and you can go back. There's an episode in the Labour government in the noughties where the cabinet considered a massive wave of house building, and somebody responded, well, no, that would crash house prices and we'd lose the election, and so the idea was shot down. So this is a concern that politicians think about. The only way that I can see forward is to have ideas and reforms that gradually improve the homes that we're building over a course of time, and that protect people. And we're going to have to make sure that we protect people who might end up underwater, the first-time buyers. I don't think the typical person who's had 50 years of house price appreciation necessarily worries actually that much about their house price. They know they've got their home, they're fine, they don't have a mortgage probably in most cases. They do care about what gets built near them and whether there's going to be a queue at the GP, but they don't worry about, that's not really the motivation of most people who are objecting to development. So I think there's a way to thread that path, but it is a tricky one.
And Simon, you talked about we need more social housing, but a lot of the people that are concerned about getting on the housing ladder are not necessarily people that want more social housing. They're the young professionals that have supposedly done everything right, got a great job, moved to the city, and are finding that they're locked out of the property owning democracy, so to speak. So how is that really a solution to where I think a lot of the resentment comes from, which is actually not so much people that may use social housing, but actually the professional middle class generation?
Wow, nice one. The key is to the point I think you made about releasing benefit money, and I think we need to go back a stage from that as well. It's not about reducing house prices. If that happens in too significant a way, beyond 15-20%, the market collapse, the banks collapse. And that's actually what predicated 2019 in the States. We have to be very, very careful that we don't, we're not triggering a financial collapse. But to begin to answer your question, the key point is that those aspirational professionals, whether that be in central London or in the suburbs, and let's remember 85% of the population of this country live in urban areas. Only 15% live in rural areas. I can speak as somebody who's had a mortgage a property for 50 years, and the mortgage went a few years ago with 2 daughters. The only way that they could afford to buy anything in London was with me subsidising their deposit. And particularly now, when we're looking at the value restrictions after the financial crisis, you need either, if you're lucky, 15, but probably 20 or even 25% deposit. You can't save up and get that on normal salaries. There may be some in high-flying jobs, that may be able to do that, but the majority of people, even your young professionals, I know what we pay our young professionals, and they can't afford mortgages. I hear it all the time. It will not happen. So we've got to have a halfway house where some of it may be shared equity, not pure rental. I mean, the housing associations have tried to do that. They replaced councils, were forced to replace councils by the government. They then sell off under right to buy and lose straight away 20% of the value of the capital they invested. So that whole financial spiral goes down. To the point though, releasing those benefit monies allows subsidies to, for example, deposit ISA schemes is one great idea. Or if they're in a rental situation, having longer term committed rental. Tighten up. I mean, we went through, I don't think there's probably anyone in the room that remembers Rachman, but I can tell you now, private rental is relatively well regulated compared to what it used to be. It needs to go another stage further and become a lot better regulated, so people can actually have longer term rentals until they decide they're in a position to buy. And we need to stop these isolated estates coming up, not just in Greenbelt, but in Greenfield, much further out from London, from Birmingham, from Manchester than they used to, so that people can then begin to have brownfield sites developed for them with government subsidy for the contamination and so on and so forth. but within a more urban environment, because that's where they want to live. And that's what my daughter said to me. We don't want to move out where you are in Hampshire. We want to live in London. I mean, they happen, one happens to be very close to here, and the other one is just south of the river in Bermondsey. You know, so nobody's going to get everything they want. But the key thing, unfortunately for me, is the fact that we seem to be focusing in too much on the top of the market with the 4 and 5 bedroom executive homes. Let's build some 1 and 2 bedroom terraces, you know, which can be an incredible design and was very successful in the Victorian era, that actually then bring the prices down so they are affordable. But I still have a plea for the social housing, because I think that will release additional funding to go back into shared equity.
And Ike, you talked about democratizing planning. You know, what do you say to the point that's been raised that, well, what if people just say no? You know, so how do you overcome that? I mean, it is all nice saying, you know, street votes and things that give people more of a say. But if communities are saying no, then where do we go from here?
Well, it's a fair point. And the way that there has to be a balance. A democracy, by its nature, is not about appeasing one group. It's trying to get a consensus amongst as many people as you can. And you're right, there will be some people who, no matter what you do, no matter how well designed it is, or how green it is, or how lovely the streets, they just will not want development happening near them for whatever reason. There's always going to be a contingent of people that are like that. That's fine. You know, as I said, we don't live in a command economy. I'm not going to force them to change their minds, but there's a soft middle, I think, which can be convinced if you assure them the infrastructure is going to be there, the design quality is going to be there. This isn't going to negatively affect the kind of the value of your home. It's going to enable your children to have somewhere to live as well. There's argument which we can present, which can help convince some people. As I said, we're never going to convince everybody, but I don't think democracy is about convincing everybody. It's about consulting as widely as possible and trying to get a consensus or majority whereby you think that you're investing in the public good. And but I think that the key to my point was, we've got, I mean, at the moment, we do have a public consultation process. I know officially we do, and we don't know about how it works, but in many instances, it is lip service. It's a stand in a local shopping centre telling people what's already been decided and giving people the kind of impression that they're involved in the scheme when it's already been agreed upon. So there are mechanisms we can do to beefen up consultation and make people feel more consulted. But yes, I do concede we're never going to be able to convince everybody, but we don't have to.
Could I just add something to that? One, the price of your property going up or down is not a material planning consideration.
No.
Which I have to remind a lot of the residents who I represent as a parish councillor quite frequently. But secondly, to your point, absolutely spot on regarding the consultation. I've spent 15 years doing central government and local government consultations. It is lip service. It's a tick. And the actual summary of that consultation often bears no resemblance to the information that's been put forward.
But how, to both of you, how do you, I'll come back to you in a second, how do you balance the fact that, you know, consultation can take a really long time,
Yes,
it can slow down the process, and actually the problem is now. And so perhaps, you know, some people in government or others might be just saying that, look, we need to supercharge this and get it done. So how do you balance the need to consult, but also the political urgency of doing something on the subject?
Well, that's exactly what the current consultation is talking about, making consultations quicker. But the problem we've got is so few people engage.
Yeah.
The general public do not engage, 95% of them. I mean, we work very, very hard, not just in my village, but across the whole ward, to get our residents to engage with the local plan consultation during the issues and concerns stage. 5,500 did, which out of a population of 120,000, the local planning authority were, oh my God, how are we going to deal with so much? They're not geared up to it.
So I'll just go to you, Andrew, you know, because you were saying that a lot of people actually, you know, do want the garden, they want the suburb,
Yeah.
you know, and all of that, and that's very legitimate. But the economy and society has changed over the last 30 years, where there's no longer like an industry that communities unite around and loads of people stay in their community, and there's that development. Actually, lots of people now have to move to city in order to get a good job, and therefore that aspiration, there seems to be a sense, almost you talk about prejudice. It seems like slight prejudices towards the young aspirational person that moves to London that just wants to get on the housing ladder. What do you say to that issue?
There's also a strong desire to escape crime in cities. And you see, I thought one of the great positives of the debate after Brexit was that suddenly towns were really popular, and think tanks ran away and said, let's have an interesting policy for towns. Towns can flourish away from the high prices that people would find in the city. So there is a dynamic. Of course, people come to cities for work. I find no shortage of think tanks and the intelligentsia fretting about about cities. Far fewer about towns and how to revive those towns. I mean, I can just give you countless examples. If the transport infrastructure between Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds improves, those beautiful towns are wonderful places to go and then commute to the city. Now, we kind of are a bit obsessed with the city. Can I ask one question, though? Because it hasn't been mentioned yet. And this is one of the things that, when I started looking at housing, fascinated me, because I was hearing about street votes, gentle density, densification, which I think all have their place. But nobody was, all right, here's the thing. Newtown, if you pulled a Newtown, you've minimised the NIMBY objections, you've put the infrastructure there, and because it's planned, you've got the mixture of flats, bedsits, gardens, and the executive homes, which we have too much of. Now, I can understand why Conservatives don't like planning, and there's loads of new towns which are really good examples of awful planning. But and it's generally kind of young policy people on the left who kind of like new towns and planning. But why is that not part of the debate? It makes sense to put stuff where people aren't. If objection is the main obstacle to development, why not put the development where the objection is minimal? France built 50 nuclear reactors in 10 years. It put them where people aren't. I was reading the late architect of HS1. The entire line was constructed, and he estimated 2 houses were within half a mile of the entire line from the Channel through to St Pancras. So if you build where people aren't and you build properly, people will come.
I just want to ask you a quick question, John. Then, in fact, say your point first.
I just want to pick up. So on new towns, I agree it's an appealing concept, and the idea of new towns was in the post-war settlement, we were going to stop building in cities, we were going to add new towns, we were going to be far away from people. The challenge that we found was, as the percentage of home ownership increased, it was impossible to build new towns with good transport connections that wasn't next to a load of existing voters in a marginal seat. So if you look at the transport capacity into major cities, Cambridge, Oxford, London, the ones with the high wages, I completely agree with you about Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, obviously. There's almost no transport capacity, and there are very, very few places where you could put a spot where one of the parties isn't going to nix it before the whole thing gets done. That's the short answer. On moving people around, your point, Inaya, we have a precedent for what we've done with the current system, which is to stop young people moving to opportunity. And that happened after the Black Death. The Black Death, 2/5 of the population died. That, by the way, is one way to end a housing crisis. It's not the one we're advocating. And the aristocracy went to the king and said, we would like you to stop our workers complaining about wanting rising better living conditions. And so the king passed a statute to stop labourers moving jobs and moving to different places. The Statute of Labourers, you can look it up. That is the exact equivalent of what we have done with current planning policy. That is an evil thing that has needlessly damaged the lives of millions of young people. And then the third is, I just wanted to know, I'm feeling slightly nervous here because Andrew's talking about saying Simon's part of a guerrilla movement, and then Ike's talking about battlefield terms like soft middle, so I'm feeling slightly vulnerable.
Just quick question I wanted to ask you. What do you say to the point about demand? Because that is obviously a very a controversial discussion, but also one that it is right that we talk a lot about supply, but actually maybe we are increasing the number of people coming into the country, and that is an issue that people don't talk about.
I'm not sure that's an issue entirely that people don't talk about, but I take the point that in fact, that's a concern that frequently people raise. This is one of the reasons why I think the way to win, the way to end this problem, is to focus relentlessly on building an alliance of people who can actually agree this is a durable solution, and not to focus on people's house prices, not to focus on divisive messages, but to focus on where we can all get happy about more good homes being added.
Question to everybody: should we get rid of right to buy? Yes or no?
Both parties do not want to get rid of right to buy. There's a very long economic debate we could go into about whether you should replace the homes there, whether you should replace them with more homes elsewhere. But both of the major parties seem to see that as an aspirational route to home ownership. So I'm not going to opine on that. We can go into the economics later if everyone wants to come and have a debate about it.
Fair enough.
Yeah, only if there is something better to replace it, and it is a price inflator, I'm afraid. And to Andrew, thank you for invoking the ghost of Ebenezer Howard. And by the way, it was the 20s when these new towns first started.
No, I'm still baffled why there isn't a consensus for new towns.
We've actually been through one. We were going to have a garden village of 8,000 houses. Unfortunately, the developer applied viability, and we lost the secondary school, we lost the shops, we lost the sports centre, and I'm afraid that's the reality at the coalface, is the promises. Not all of them are delivered at the end of the day, and you will go through a 5 to 10 year period. Most developers will release between 50 to 100 dwellings per site, and that is to maintain the price level. So you go through a long period of disruption, and what you expected to get at the end of it, or what you as a potential councillor or a campaign leader have actually promised your residents with the developer, is not delivered.
And just before we go to the floor, there is the proposal about the building lots of new homes and lab spaces in Cambridge. It'd be interesting to know what people on the panel think about that, because there are some that say are really worried about this. You know, they feel that the proper infrastructure is not going to be developed in order to sustain the increase in the numbers of people. But there are others who are saying, actually, this is essential to unleashing the potential of Cambridge, which they need more lab space. They need more homes in order to enable Cambridge to actually be the innovator that it is. So it'd just be interesting to know what people in the panel, if you're familiar with that whole discussion. Ike, do you want to?
Well, that's part of a wider policy that Gove announced in July in terms of, I think it was Cambridge and Thames Estuary and Leeds were going to be three kind of pilot areas where they would intensify and densify around the edges of the city. Look, again, I don't have a problem with it. I know I'm often accused of bringing housing down to really simplistic terms, but I think it can work if you get the basics right. If you make sure the infrastructure is there, if you make sure the right mix of accommodation is there for the demand, if you make sure the houses are a good enough quality, then I know Cambridge has unique circumstances because it is obviously a global university town with a huge tech sector, but the principle is the same. Provide the infrastructure, make the quality decent enough, make the mix responsive to local demand, make sure it's the right kind of housing in the right place, then frankly, regardless of what it looks like, it should work. So hopefully that will be the case. And just briefly, just 'cause I didn't answer it, I have no problem with right to buy as long as every sold unit is replaced with a new one. I know that's a big thing, difficult thing to achieve, but in principle, if that was the case, then I wouldn't have a problem with it.
So, Cambridge has among the most productive firms in the country. If you're going to build homes anywhere, Cambridge is one of the most sensible places to put them. I suppose it comes back to the question of new towns. If you're going to build a new town and you know already that wherever you build it is going to be controversial, then maybe putting it next to Cambridge effectively is a good way forward, because broadly, the population of Cambridge is pro-growth. There are a lot of tenants, there are people renters who would like to see more housing. I completely agree the infrastructure is key. Currently, I think we're planning to take longer to build the new reservoir for the water that Cambridge needs than it took the Emperor Caligula, a man who made his horse proconsul, to build the Aqua Claudia, an aqueduct into Rome. I think we might be able to do better than that. It goes back to the length of time of consultation. But, you know, there is a clear, massive shortage of homes in Cambridge. In any sane world, we will be doing much better than this.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that. I really agree with Ike and John, actually. One of the things that may change, that I don't see anything changing the housing debate other than something external to the housing debate. In other words, a huge rebalancing of wealth away from London towards and away from Cambridge even. Not making Cambridge smaller, but make, you know, if you're an ambitious scientist, you may want to work in Manchester or Bristol. A different economy would lead to a very different debate on housing, I think. But currently it's look, if you think I'm obnoxious, you should go out and talk to how people think when we are told there aren't enough houses, but there are 600,000 to 1 million new arrivals. That's like 2 Birminghams a year. And there's no way we're going to build 2 Birminghams a year. So we have to kind of, if you think that's divisive, and I agree, you have to do something about the demand. And I think it's behoving on governments to control their border. If a government can't control the border, it ceases to be a nation state. And I think we've got a great record on this. I think people are pretty liberal. I think they're expressing discontent, almost like they're fighting a different battle. It's not really housing they're objecting to. They may be objecting to an uber low-wage economy when they talk about objections to migration. So there's much more going on about housing, but this is the sea we have to swim in, and I think very small measures don't really move the needle anywhere.
Thank you. Well, we're gonna now open it up to the floor, so please put your hand up, and we'll take a couple at a time, then we'll go just so we can get as many perspectives in. We'll start with you at the front there.
Thank you. A lot of the talk on the supply side reform is about, you know, better buildings, more collaboration, faster planning. But that doesn't change things where you've got a little old lady who's got a nice house, just likes things the way they are, doesn't care about money, that's it. What do we need to do to bring those people on the journey, to give them some benefit from the expansion? Do we need to look at bribes? Do we need to look at contributions? How do we bring everybody along?
Thank you. We'll take 2 more, then we'll go back to the floor. The lady in the... Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on something that's been talked about a lot and something that has been completely ignored. And the thing that's been talked about a lot is the lack of participation and consultation, and why people don't participate, and why consultations are bad, and why they're flawed. And I mean, I think a large reason for that is because people don't trust the system. So, and who do they not trust? They don't trust the local government, they don't trust the planning system, but more to the point, they don't trust, what my next point is, we haven't talked about, they don't trust developers. And they see developers as like purveyors of doom. Like they see developers as not giving them hope. And, you know, in terms of developers, I have never seen an industry that has absolutely zero self-regulation. For an industry that has huge impact on our health and well-being, there is absolutely no regulation on how we behave. The medical profession intervenes in our lives all the time, and they take a Hippocratic oath when they get trained, and they say to do no harm. The development industry doesn't even come close to that. So how do you expect local people to run out and support a development when they simply do not trust these people? And how do we work to look at that other part of the supply side, the development community, who really, they fund the political parties and they actually run riot over our land with absolutely no regulation? I mean, anybody in this room put their hand up and tell me that they love Barclay Group.
Thank you. Okay, but no, that's a good question about trust towards developers and the system more broadly. We'll take the lady just at the back then.
Actually, similar way, my hand's not up because I love Barclay. But it's on planning, so why aren't all new builds EPC A and B rated? Why don't they come with solar panels and air source heat? Surely that should be mandatory now. And the second question again on planning is, if you give a planning permission for a new estate of 100 homes why don't you enforce the social housing 20% or 15%? I just don't get that.
Okay. So we've got a question on how do we bring some people, certain groups along, trust in the system, and the final question. Does anyone want to pick up first?
Can I just pick up that
Yeah, sure.
the last two questions? One, our local planning authority's policy for affordable is 40%. And most now of our other local LPAs around us have gone with that. That came through resident force to make that happen. And I know a lot do much lower. Developers try, to the other lady's point, developers try very hard not to do that based on viability. And you need a very strong leader of your council and a very strong set of officers to push back against that. I won't answer the other question. In terms of solar panels, we have been asking for that for 15 years. That's myself and my wife, who's a district councillor, on cabinet. They cannot enforce it, and the developers come back with evidence that people are asking for buildings without solar panels on them. They don't want them. That's the excuse they use. And because of that, it's not carried through by officers, because normally officers are very risk averse because they're worried about their next job, quite rightly. It's like doing a local plan. They won't question the housing numbers on a local plan, because if on their resume that they were in charge of looking after a local plan that was rejected at public inspection by the examiner, they're going to find it very difficult to find a further job at a higher level. It's very sad. It's dreadful.
So I'm going to completely agree that any way forward involves making sure that developers deliver what they promise. We can discuss about what that should be. But I think the other point I want to come back to was Harry's question about what do we do about the little old ladies? And I think, first of all, I don't think we should bribe them. I think we have to recognise that some people are just bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, and they will always object and they will always fight housing. And so we have to come up with things that work around that or work despite that. And this is where it comes back to a point that Ike made. And I would respectfully disagree slightly about what the room that London has for more homes. So the densest part of London is Maida Vale. Nobody has with a straight face told me that Maida Vale is some kind of hellhole. Now, if we took some of the streets of HMOs and some of the estates where councillors tell me that their tenants are clamouring for renovation, for renewal, to add more homes on those, we could easily outdo 20 years of London home building. There is plenty of space in London to add lots more homes, and you can do that without really interfering with any major clusters of little old ladies who don't want them nearby. London is very heterogeneous, and so it's a question of focusing change where change is actually desired, and there will be a few places that hold out, but in the end, we've got plenty of room if we just use it properly, and so that's not a problem.
Just before we move on, why haven't these ideas happened then? Yeah, because this you mentioned consultation's been mentioned. Also, you mentioned the fact that there's been, I think, several different housing ministers or so on and so forth. Or 15. Why? Because there's lots of interesting ideas that we've been discussing and floated about. What is the barrier to that happening?
The barrier is exactly what the lady at the back said, that we keep trying the same thing over and over again, and there are huge, frankly, vested interests who don't really want a better system. Yep. And so if we don't try new things, we won't get anywhere. Thankfully, we are finally seeing stirrings in both parties to actually try new things, and so I am hopeful about that.
I would suggest, if you really want to know, you go for a meeting at DLUC.
Right.
Seriously, then you'll discover why things don't happen. It's unbelievable.
Well, that's our task. Everyone in the room to go and do that.
Demand to go and talk to somebody at DLUC.
Can I just be more radical than Simon? So I actually slightly disagree that we need more consultation. I think we actually need more power to the people.
Absolutely. John, you
Slightly
and I are in
different thing,
complete
yeah.
agreement, and that's on film.
Because if you offer them an attractive package, the people will choose it.
Absolutely
I agree,
correct.
they will do.
Yep.
Is there anything Ike or Andrew you want to?
I see no evidence that people would choose a package. They said they don't view these things transactionally, and I think it's a mistake to think that people are so sort of. It's a cynical view of human beings, to be honest. That if you just bribe them enough, they'll go along with it. It's just not the right way to approach it. I see no evidence that that's worked anywhere in Britain. Sorry, I see. Yeah, sorry. I see no evidence that if you make an attractive package, people will sign up for it.
There
I
are
see no
plenty of
evidence
examples
that.
of neighbourhood plans allocating sites. There are examples of redevelopment in Clapham. There are examples of redevelopment in Camden. There are examples all over the world of people energetically choosing more housing. And so if you don't want to offer people a package,
Right.
you're essentially
Can-
saying
can I-
you need to
yeah.
impose things on people.
Can-
Those are the two. You either give them a choice or you impose. Which do you prefer?
Can I point something out, which is the kind of maniacal fascination with street votes has now led to people rebranding regeneration exercises where there's a block of a couple of thousand and a state of 2,000 people and they vote as a street vote. That's not a street vote. It's not a block vote. It's saying we would like this particular design,
that's
not
in your
that
head,
particular.
Andrew. It's in your head.
No. It's that particular. Look, people are rebranding community consultations as street votes in the effort to. I'm just saying this. Pinning your faith that if you bribe them or give them this attractive package, they'll do it. I really don't agree with
that
it.
no one will accept development. I mean, surely there are.
I'm not saying no one will, but I'm saying
surely there are certain circumstances. If there is an attractive offer and you understand that infrastructure is going to be built in your community, maybe you'll have new shops and things that will give vibrancy to your area. That will convince people that this is a good thing.
yes, and I take the point that if infrastructure is improved, then there will be some consent in
Yeah,
that community
exactly, that's what we're
and
saying.
it will go down. Yeah.
Can I give a really quick example of where it actually worked? An old brewery called the Bass Brewery was sold, and the residents demanded from the town council and the LPA, we must have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. And the developer said, well, sorry, no, this is a private sale. This is private land. It's nothing to do with you. Anyway, we managed to get the council to talk with the developer. I won't mention which developer it was, but we ended up with market housing, 40% affordability, a 20-bed care home with warden, and also another 20 retirement homes. Now, as somebody who's approaching that very rapidly, I know what a retirement home means. It means bigger doors, bigger rooms, ways you can get up and down, downstairs shower if you can't get upstairs, etc. All of that produced to meet the residents. Suddenly, the objections to the development disappeared. There were some S106 contributions and also some SIL payments, but they also threw in a community building as well. But that needed to be pushed, and the residents eventually agreed.
We'll go back to the floor. Lots of questions.
Starmer government, first 100 days, do they do anything on housing?
Okay, we'll take a few.
Hi there. The UK isn't the only country with a housing crisis or very high prices. We could count New Zealand, Canada, and California among places that have similar house price crises. What are the lessons to learn from these countries and states, many of which have seemingly much more advanced movements to change things?
Right. Australia.
Hi, I wanted to ask about immigration. I think only Andrew spoke about it on the panel. I've heard arguments pro-immigration. We need more migrations to cover these skills that are required to build houses because we've lost those particular skills domestically, and also anti-immigration. In fact, we've got lots more graduates, lots more students coming in and competing with UK-born graduates for jobs in cities and creating more housing pressure. I wondered what the other panelists thought about immigration.
Take one more question before we go to one.
So I work in local government planning. That there's many of us in this room. I guess my question is, I think someone who pointed out big barriers, the planning system, and I guess my question is what you think needs to happen to it to deliver the houses we actually need, because what I find in my day-to-day job is I'm working with developers And we have policies, London Plan has policies for housing, for good design, sustainable homes, and that's what we're pushing, and that's my goal as an officer. But we're fighting developers who want to push, and their main goal, one of their goals is obviously to make profit, and building 3-bedroom houses in social rent and building 35% social rent isn't gonna, that's not what they want. They push, they say viability, and I'm sure it's a tough climate at the moment to build, but I guess I don't see how. I mean, I'd like to hear about what you think must happen to the planning system to actually, make developers build what apparently we need.
Thank you. So, question on Starmer, first 100 days, what we can learn from other countries, immigration, and what objectively, concretely needs to be done to the planning system. Who wants to pick up first?
Starmer, I think he will. I think Labour is very keen to show that they want to do things on housing, and so I think we will definitely see action within the first 100 days. I'd be very surprised if they don't hit the ground running with some things that they've already prepared. On New Zealand, California, there are plenty of lessons to be learned. I think the first lesson is if you can get both major parties to agree on an incredibly ambitious housing reform, then you can achieve a huge amount. I don't see any sign of that consensus in this country. And so, but if you know how to engineer one, please get in touch. I slightly reject the premise that the other housing movements are way ahead of us. I think the jury is out on that. Let's come back in 10 years and see who actually ends up having produced lots more housing. If you look at trends in San Francisco, for example, it hasn't been as great as it could. I mean, they've fought some incredible battles. Don't get me wrong, but the numbers haven't come through yet. I'm not going to touch immigration. I'm going to defer to others on the question about planning.
Okay. Well, I think the left has traditionally less antipathy towards planning. It kind of quite likes planning. So I think that Starmer would have the opportunity, a Labour government would immediately have the opportunity to punch holes in the green belt. I don't think that act is ever going to be repealed. And it's sort of futile to pretend that you can wave a magic wand and the green belt goes away. But I think it could punch holes with anticipating infrastructure quite effectively, in the first year or two, and it would have an emphasis on social housing, which again has been absent from a lot of these debates.
Just a quick question to you, Simon, because you mentioned that we need to build on brownfield sites, and there is that discussion about the green belt, and actually some people are pushing back to those that say don't build on the green belt, because actually if you look at many of those sites, they're not this, lovely, flowing countryside. A lot of them could actually be legitimately built on. What do you say to that?
Wow. Okay. Do you want the quick 5 minutes or the full 2-hour lecture?
Quick 1 minute.
Okay. I mean, the issue with the green belt is the green belt is totally out of date. Large areas of the green belt are virtually industrial wasteland. It's not all farmland. It's not all beautiful green countryside. Yes, a lot of it is, but it's there for a very simple reason: to prevent urban sprawl. And it was designated many, many years ago. It needs a government body, God help us, probably DLUC, to actually redefine the green belts based on the changes that have happened over the last 20, 30 years. That's number one. Punching holes in the green, it's already done. There are an enormous number of applications being put in for Greenbelt based on the planners in the room will understand, based on special exceptions. It's already happening. I don't think it'll need a Labour government to do that. And finally, to the point regarding Labour, just cast your minds back to the noughties and the chaos we had with John Prescott in charge of planning as Deputy Prime Minister. It was appalling.
So did you feel the question was answered? What concretely needs to change on the planning front? So if anyone wanted to pick up.
No. I'm happy. I spend a lot of time with planning officers. I think you're some of the most overworked people I've ever met. You're under the cosh. You've got incredible. Somebody was very aggressive, not aggressive, critical of developers. Not all developers are like that. There are a number, and I can think of the names, and I'm not going to say them. There are also people called land promoters, and a particular land promoter who recently were acquired by a very large national builder, who in the old days used to have a helicopter in their TV ad. they are the sort of people that make your life a misery because they're not there to compromise, they're not there to communicate, they're there to conflict and confront you. That is not the way a planning system should work. And if you don't do what they want, as is literally, I've just found out this morning with a 300 dwelling site in our village, they'll just go straight to appeal. They'll bypass the planning committee and they'll roll the dice, and 1 out of 10 wins. 100 house development, that's £30 million, the value of that site, and they'll walk away with 8 million profit. It's big money. That's why it's difficult.
Do you pick up on the immigration point as well, because no one's...
Yeah, I'll pick up on that just after the planning point, if that's all right. I know planning's come in for a bit of a kick in for good reasons sometimes on this panel, but I think it's good to say where planning has actually had some successes. And one of those successes is in London. It is the London Plan. I think over the past 10, 15 years, the London Plan has actually been, I mean, it's flawed in certain areas. I think it's far too vague and fluid on things like tall buildings or kind of aesthetics. But in terms of housing quality, saying you should have this room this size, or you should have developments which should have these amenities attached, I actually think it's been pretty good in terms of raising quality of housing in London. You still have the fundamental problem of supply, but in terms of what's being produced, I think it's been a good example. I think part of the reason you may come up against such opposition with developers and others when trying to implement those policies is because fundamentally, somebody asked before, why don't developers give people more of what they want? Basically, because they know they don't essentially have to. Because we have constrained supply, no matter what they produce, it's going to sell. So there's no incentive from their point of view to work with planners to create a better product. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's such opposition. But also...
What would changing planning do?
Well, specifically in London, I think one of the problems in London is you have the London Plan, you have the GLA level, then you've got 33 boroughs that they do their own thing. They have their own local plans, and it's too much. You've got additional layers of bureaucracy, which stakeholders, developers, architects, understandably, are sometimes confused by. So I think planning, it's a London problem, but I think it applies elsewhere as well. It has to be streamlined. People don't like having different sets of rules to have to comply with. Have simple, clear statutory guidelines, do it once and it's done. So simplifying that process, I think, is something that needs to happen. And just very briefly on immigration, look, I know we joked before about everybody does talk about immigration in terms of the impact it has on housing supply. But the governments don't, politicians don't. It's not an issue that's been discussed in any meaningful way politically. And I get why, I understand it. It's inherently a divisive issue, as John alluded to earlier, and nobody wants to kind of use the housing market and the problems with it as a kind to weaponize it against minorities or vulnerable people, etc. So I can understand why it's not a political issue. My approach to it would be, I get it, on one level, if you have high demand, and if you don't acknowledge you have high demand, and if you don't create supply to meet that high demand, then you're never going to do it. There's always going to be an undersupply. So on one level, yes, you do have to acknowledge, you talked about borders earlier, you have to acknowledge that there may be greater numbers of people needing housing supply. But my solution to it, or my approach to it would not be to identify immigration or immigrants as a particular housing group. And what you still need to do is get the fundamentals about improving supply generally right. Do all the things we talked about, improving and providing more social housing stock so that you release pressure from the market, release housing benefit for other investments, so that you don't have the pressures and the blockages which are then exacerbated by maybe more immigrants using the housing system. So the solution is not to treat it as an immigration problem, but it's a housing problem.
It's a well. Yeah, sure, go.
No, please.
For half of my adult life, immigration has been a racist issue. It's just simple as that. I don't think you can say it has been for 20 years because there's wage competition, and governments have successively said to the working class, "I'm sorry, you may now be replaced by somebody cheaper." This is the. As somebody who's pretty liberal, my response is, well, why aren't you making the moral case for immigration if you need it so much, if the birth rate is so low, and so on? I think not mentioning immigration is simply it leads to very dark things. People will then take advantage of it. But the fundamental point is you're saying to Britain, oh, it's a supply problem, and people will say we need 2 Birminghams a year. That's not going to get built. If it's 6,000 a year or 1 million, you're not going to win that argument, and that's the case we're all in, really.
And then we'll go back to the floor.
So I just wanted to come back to the question about planning, and let me be absolutely clear that almost every planner I have ever met has had the very best of intentions and works incredibly hard, doing a very tough job. I think part of the problem is simply that the current system does not give planners the tools to actually impose a rigidly enforceable obligation that developers will comply with. And we need to get to a much more predictable system, both for the developers and the planners, so that developers know they have to deliver what they're told to deliver, but they also know what that is. And until we get there, we're going to continue to have these problems.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's too much interpretation, which
Well,
often comes out at the appeal.
Very much so, yeah.
I'm going to go back to the floor. You're at the back there.
So my question to the panel is, obviously you've all spoken a lot about housing scarcity today. We're not scrapping all the green belts around the country, be a major improvement in the status quo.
We'll take a few. Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear if anyone has some like radical ideas, like that, provocations.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about better ways of persuading NIMBYs to kind of like join the other side in a way. I was just wondering if there's an application for using like AI generated images, like the Cambridge ones, kind of like in a way like door knocking on those different people and kind of persuade them being more pro urbanism and have lots of construction in the area that looks good actually benefits them.
We'll take
Good luck with that.
gentlemen.
So on radical ideas, Dominic Cummings explained the success of the Brexit referendum to be fundamentally that no one else understood that you could cut clean across political lines by putting a particular issue right at the forefront and putting it straight to the people. It seems extraordinary that we're talking about the degree of demand and urgency about this across the country, but there still isn't the political entrepreneurship to put it to people and get things done. So is an answer, I'd think of this on the hoof, but in response to you saying, is there a radical answer here? Is it for Labour, say, to come up with a referendum to go to the country on housing, this suite of reforms, and if there is the demand that we're saying there is, could that be a route to radical change?
Great. We'll just take one more question before we go back to the.
I think in terms of kind of solutions, there's a lot of there's a lot of incentives to try and play kind of puppet master with the planning system, because there are people with defined interest that you can see and name and caricature, and like the instinct to nudge and probe to get the outcome we want isn't a particularly democratic one. I wonder if there's actually just like a really gobsmackingly simple answer in front of us, which is that we all have a bit of a role in creating a political culture where we can name what public goods we want in society, and specifically where they should be and built and provided for, because we're not just talking about housing, we're also talking about all of the other things, from energy, as we've seen recently, to schools and other parts of public infrastructure that have been really criticised very heavily because they were built badly. Like, how do we find a political culture that is confident enough to talk about kind of provision that we want here confidently? Because I think there are lots of different tools already available. They're just dead legislation. No one's going to build a new town. Neighbourhood planning is a very difficult thing to get over the line. Local development orders don't really get, like, all of the technical stuff exists. It's the political will that seems to be missing kind of everywhere.
Lots of really interesting points there. Who wants to pick up?
The political will one is interesting, and I think the answer's quite depressing. The political will probably won't be there, and it won't be there because we have a short-termist political system whereby politicians who are in charge of our quasi-judicial planning system are interested in 4 or 5 year term and what works within that. So not to be too depressing about it, look, I think political will has to be part of the solution, but it can't, you're not saying it will be all of it, it can't be all of it, because the political framework, the political ecosystem we have just doesn't generate enough long-term
We've always had, 5-year terms, and but is there something different about now, that the problem of short-termism? Because presumably, in the other times when we've done transformative change to the public good, we had that same system. So is there something different?
Other countries do have. If you look at the last time we built loads and loads of housing in this country was probably, well, the most recent point in which we built a lot of housing was the 1950s under the Macmillan government. Now a Tory government, not only, they took it upon themselves to be defined by their performance within housing, and they achieved it. They built a huge number of homes. But if you look at the levers they had more levers than are available to a government today. You had nationalised industries. They could order the creation of more cement to be made. They had developers and construction companies. Some of them were publicly owned as well. There were more levers whereby they were able to expedite their political ambition. Now, we don't live in that kind of political culture anymore. I'm not saying it's not possible to do it within a short-termist culture, but we have to be realistic and accept that it's incredibly difficult to incentivize politicians to do that with the current framework. And final point on this is as well, someone talked about referendums. It's really interesting. The problem, I think housing is a unique problem. It's different to defence, it's different to healthcare, and it's unique because there are political incentives to solve the housing crisis. They're obvious. We're talking about public good, providing homes for people, making housing more affordable. There's obvious political incentives to solve it. But there are also political incentives to sustain the housing crisis as well. To don't annoy constituents who don't want housing nearby them, to not ruffle the boat. We've seen the government abandon housing targets. Why would they do that? If it was a political win, there's obviously a political constituency of people who that appeals to. So housing's unique. It's very emotive. And because we have this kind of schizophrenic approach whereby the politicians have an incentive to solve it, but also to sustain it, I think that makes it a very, very difficult thing to fix solely politically.
There's quite a few. Should we abolish the green belt?
So I very much enjoyed the scrapping the green belt suggestion. I think even the most vitriolic detractors of the green belt generally shy away from proposing complete scrapping. Let me give you the good news that we certainly don't need to scrap the entire green belt in order to completely meet any demand for housing in the southeast. I wish you luck with that proposal.
Thank you.
Are there better ways of persuading NIMBYs? AI generated images, great. This is clearly, I think AI is going to have a big role in the future in design. Will the NIMBYs trust that you are going to deliver the AI images that you have just generated? That is an entirely different question. As Andrew said, I wish you luck. Should we have a referendum on housing? Again, let's remember, so we come back to the sort of political culture and the real political constraints that any referendum is going to have to get through the House of Lords, and as we've just seen, it is vulnerable to being chipped away at by various interests afterwards. It's a fun idea, happy to brainstorm about it afterwards. I think we might need to work on it a bit. And can we change the political culture? Well, I'm afraid I'm a lawyer and culture is way above my pay grade. I'm going to slightly disagree about the argument that we have all the tools in our toolkit already, because I think for exactly the reasons you said, neighbourhood plans are very difficult to do, LDOs are also challenging, they haven't delivered very much. There's a whole field of social science called mechanism design, for which people have won Nobel Prizes, which explains how to work out how to create a set of rules so that if people are acting in what they perceive as the interests of their families and their communities, they will deliver an outcome which is better for society as well. The current system is essentially designed as if someone had taken that whole field of learning, thrown it in the bin, and then done the precise opposite. So I would respectfully disagree that we have the technical rules that we need.
Andrew?
No.
Back on the point about we need a much more democratic culture. We have the
I think the more democratic you make it, the more people will object. If it's that kind of, if it means a longer queue at the school and more traffic, and
That's true.
if you give people more chance to say no, they'll say no. This is kind of what they're doing now, isn't it?
If you give them a better product, then they might be less likely.
All right, okay. Let's say chipping Barnet is a product, right? You know this town. It's essentially, to anyone who doesn't, most of them I'm sure you do, but it's a small Hertfordshire market town which just happens to fall inside the M25. The road at the least busy time is chocker. So, you know, it's got huge estates on one side. It's got tiny, infrastructure's a crippling problem there because you can't drive through it. People cling to the character, that little sort of urban, rural character that it's got out there, so tenaciously. It means so much to them. That is really the wrong place to, they will fight tooth and nail. They will fight extremely hard to stop even small development there, which is why my great puzzle is, it's easier to build 20,000 where nobody is objecting, and then you can have experiments like Poundbury or whatever kind of brutalist paradise you want. Oh, actually, we've had too many of those already since World War II. But then you have that, the garden and the city and access to transport. I think we'll see more of those. In fact, aren't there 17? You know this stuff better than I do. Aren't there 17 new towns were proposed about 6 years ago? There's a white paper, and of course nothing happens because it's Britain and nothing happens.
Well,
We'll just take.
what a wonderful segue. It's exactly what I said earlier.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of talk, but very little walk.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid Mr. Gove is the worst at it.
Yeah.
Talks an awful lot, but actually does very, very little.
Well, Gove's in here to defend himself. I'm sure he'll say something later.
He's big enough and ugly enough to look after himself. To the point about the highest build, some of you will be familiar with that ONS graph. It was 1968 that the highest was, and that was 350,000 dwellings around, looks like about a quarter of which were local authorities and the rest were private market. So
That's gross, not net.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We demolished a lot
but
too.
Since then, it's been rather pathetic, quite frankly.
Okay.
Quick answer to a couple of the points.
Quickly.
Political culture. I think the lady said it earlier. Our politicians don't run the housing and development business. The companies do. It's financial. Do never underestimate the power of lobbyists and the financial bankrollers.
So we will take one last round, but we'll just have 1 minute kind of response, like closing remarks, but just to hit more thoughts rather than questions, because we won't be able to answer questions. So if people just have thoughts, please, quickly.
I think we're always talking about people that are saying no, but most people just don't care. Like I go out to consult all the time. People just don't care. And we need to listen to the large majority as well, rather than just listen to the people that respond, which are usually the ones that are saying no.
Good point. Just this one.
Is that me?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say with the bananas point, I don't think we should think about the little old lady. We should think about the marginal converter. So it's not necessarily the hardest person to convert. It needs to be the next person in line who is possible to convert. We shouldn't think about the most difficult first.
Thank you. Sam.
Without wishing to be pessimistic, perhaps we need a further fall in home ownership rates to then force the issue. So, we're at 62% at the moment. We're at 73 in 2007. Maybe if we can push towards 50, then the status quo will be busted, and that wonderful deal for new homes is going to arise.
It needs to get worse and get better eventually.
Yeah, just touching on sort of John said about mechanism design, tying into what we said before. Like, obviously, actually, one thing that everyone says they want is infrastructure support housing and social housing, but it doesn't happen really as much as anyone would like.
Exactly.
So, surely there must be some mechanistic tinkering that can happen, even if you didn't have to do like radical overhaul. There must be something, right?
Has anyone not spoken yet?
So, I mean, on the very good question over there on the problem in the planning system, I think much of the problem is that planners are being asked to do an impossible job the number of considerations, if you go through a planning inspector report, the number of considerations they have to take into account to come to a decision is this endless balancing of dozens of issues, and it is just an impossible task. And one of the things we need to do is cut down on the number of things they need to consider. Maybe it doesn't maybe less than significant heritage assets and so on and so forth. It's something that we can do without. And that would help, I think, would make your job easier, hopefully, like, because it'd be less to do, I hope.
Right, well, sorry we couldn't take any more points. Thank you for lots of interesting perspectives and thoughts. We'll just take 30-second closing remarks from each of the panellists.
To those comments, apathy, biggest problem we've got. People don't engage. Go for the low hanging fruit. Absolutely. Not the little old lady. It's the people that are convert and downsize and release rooms. Home ownership. I'm going to avoid that one. Infrastructure. National infrastructure levy. Nobody's mentioned it tonight. Do we actually want all that to go to central government? I'm not sure it would be spent properly. My biggest single issue, though, is still we've got to actually get the supply up. You will not do anything by building 300,000 houses a year. That's less than 1% of the total number of homes in this country. It will not affect the price.
Thank you. Ike, 30 seconds.
Yes, just a closing plea for quality, basically, and it's I suppose it's a plea to architects, a plea to the planning system as well. We have to. I know I've invested a lot tonight in saying we need a better product, make things better, but obviously I'm an architect, but I genuinely philosophically believe that if design quality improved, it would help ease a lot of the problems we've talked about. And just two final conversant, council housing, which we've talked about a lot as well, and also John's point about density. I think we have to get very clever about density. I think the Greenbelt argument is a bit of a distraction. We don't need to build on the Greenbelt. London, as an example, there's tons of space in London, brownfield sites that could still be developed if we got more intelligent about density. So I think that's something we need to do.
Thank you.
Apathy, I think you're absolutely right, but the trouble is that the people who do care a huge amount and they vote, and their councillors, their elected representatives worry about those swing voters going to the other party. So we have to design a system that works with that, despite it. The trouble on home ownership is that both parties, well, the trouble with your view on home ownership is that both parties want it to go higher. So yes, frankly, it would make the whole situation easier just in terms of housing supply if we had a low rate of home ownership. I don't think it's likely to happen, but I think we will simplify the planning system by giving people confidence. And I'm optimistic that even if we don't reduce home ownership, we will get to a better planning system that delivers more and better homes.
Thank you. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is that there just aren't great examples of dense urban city densification that people can look at and go, well, that's brilliant. I'll think I might stay here a long time and put down roots here and bring up a family here. I mean, the houses are pretty nice, Hendon, Colindale, but these are kind of look like some dystopian science fiction, beige biscuit tin, blocks everywhere. I'm sure they fulfill a need, but it's not, there isn't a sense of place there where people want to spend a long time. Sorry if I'm pessimistic, but I think unless the country becomes this great kind of overheated engine of London, and then maybe different pockets of other areas, I think if the big picture changes, we might not get so neurotic about housing. Until then, I don't see it.
Well, on that positive note,
Yes.
can we have a really big round of applause for our fantastic